Our global economy feels like a force of nature, an unstoppable engine of progress. But what if I told you that its primary fuel is a paradox? That the entire system is powered by a single, astronomical number that grows larger every second. A number that, by December 2025, exceeds $346 trillion. That is the total sum of the world's debt. And here is the truly baffling part. This is not viewed as a catastrophic failure of the system. It is the system. We are taught to fear debt, to avoid it, to treat it as something inherently dangerous. Yet once you pull back the curtain on how the world actually works, you begin to see a hidden architecture, one so deeply embedded, so fundamental to modern life, that turning it off is no longer a realistic option. This is not a story about reckless spending or greedy bankers. This is the story of a global financial machine designed to never stop running. A machine that has become so complex and so essential that no one on Earth truly knows how to fix it, or whether it can even be fixed at all. And to understand why, we must first accept a truth that feels fundamentally wrong, yet defines our modern age. The government of the United States, the wealthiest nation in history, is currently in debt by nearly $38.5 trillion. It is a figure so colossal that it defies intuitive comprehension, a string of zeros that quickly dissolves into abstraction. And yet every single dollar represents a real promise made to a real holder, a legal guarantee of future repayment. The popular narrative often points outward. China, oil-rich states in the Middle East, foreign rivals financing American excess. And while countries such as Japan and the United Kingdom do hold trillions of dollars in United States government bonds, their combined holdings account for only a fraction of the total. The real picture is far more intricate and far more self-referential. Because here is the great irony. The very same nations lending money to the United States are themselves among the most indebted countries on the global stage. Japan is the clearest example. Its national debt exceeds 250% of its annual economic output, the highest ratio in the developed world. So who is financing Japan's monumental borrowing? The overwhelming majority is held domestically by Japanese citizens and institutions, including banks, pension funds, insurance companies, and other financial entities. The Bank of Japan plays a central stabilizing role within this system, but it is not the sole holder. And the story becomes even more circular, because Japan, as a country, remains one of the largest foreign holders of debt issued by the United States. Not because of leverage or control, but because U.S. Treasury bonds are still widely regarded as the safest place to store large pools of capital. And what about Europe's financial giants? They hold American debt, Japanese debt, and the debt of their neighboring countries. If this sounds like an inescapable web of mutual obligation, that is precisely what it is. The further you investigate, the clearer it becomes that the global financial system is not a pyramid with a single creditor at the top. It is a closed sphere with no clear beginning and no clear end. Every advanced economy is simultaneously a borrower and a lender. And this is how we arrive at a world where collective global debt has grown beyond $340 trillion, a sum that is orders of magnitude larger than all the physical currency that actually exists. If the entire world is borrowing, who, ultimately, is doing the lending? It is a question that sounds like it should conceal a grand conspiracy, yet the answer reveals something far more profound about the operating system of our civilization. It reveals that the modern world is not built on savings or tangible assets, but on promises, an endless chain of promises about future growth and future prosperity. This is the story of how that chain was forged, link by link, until it became the invisible infrastructure supporting nearly everything around us. And it brings us face to face with the most daunting question of our time. What happens when the promises grow too large to keep? The idea of debt may feel like a modern invention, a digital figure flickering on a screen, but its roots are as old as civilization itself. Debt is, at its core, a technology of trust. Long before currency existed, debt functioned as the social glue holding communities together. Imagine a blacksmith in a medieval village whose tools have broken. He needs new ones to work, but has no immediate goods to trade. He goes to a merchant and makes a promise. "Provide me with the tools now, and I will repay you with a share of my future labor." That promise, that extension of value from the future into the present, is the essence of debt. It was a personal covenant, a bond between two individuals grounded in reputation and mutual need. For most of history, debt remained confined to this small interpersonal scale. But as empires rose, their ambitions quickly began to outgrow the personal fortunes of their rulers. A king seeking to fund a crusade or construct a great cathedral could not simply turn to his wealthiest nobles for a loan. They often lacked the necessary liquidity. And more importantly, the king himself might not be trusted to repay them. A transformative innovation was required, and it came from an unexpected source. During the 12th and 13th centuries, the Knights Templar, a militant order of monks, created what many historians regard as the first international banking network. A pilgrim traveling to the Holy Land could deposit his gold at a Templar preceptory in London and receive a coded letter of credit. That letter could then be presented in Jerusalem, where the pilgrim would withdraw the equivalent sum. In effect, the Templars were creating and managing debt across vast distances, backed not by armies or territory, but by their reputation for absolute trustworthiness. This idea that an institution's promises could be treated as valuable as physical gold became the seed of modern finance. By the late 17th century, England was locked in a costly war with France and was desperately short of funds. The Crown's solution was ingenious. In 1694, it established the Bank of England. This was not simply a royal treasury. It was a private institution granted a unique privilege. The bank would lend money to the government. In return, the government granted it the authority to issue paper banknotes. These notes were effectively IOUs issued by the bank. But because they were backed by the full taxing power of the British state, they were widely accepted as currency. This was a financial revolution. The state had effectively merged its power with the power of finance, creating a mechanism to borrow vast sums of money directly from the public and the broader financial system. The modern concept of national debt was born. The model proved so effective that it became the blueprint for nation-states across the world. By the dawn of the 20th century, a country's power was measured not only by the size of its army, but by its ability to borrow. The World Wars and the Great Depression pushed this system to its limits, forcing governments to borrow on a scale that would have been unimaginable just a century earlier. In the aftermath, world leaders gathered at Bretton Woods in 1944 to design a more stable global order. They placed the United States dollar at the heart of that system, establishing it as the world's reserve currency. Every other major currency would be pegged to the dollar, and the dollar itself would be pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. For a time, this arrangement created an illusion of stability. But the system carried a fatal weakness. The amount of gold on Earth is finite. The human appetite for economic expansion is not. As the American economy boomed through the 1950s and 1960s, and as government spending surged to fund both the Vietnam War and expansive social programs, the volume of dollars circulating around the world began to dwarf the amount of gold held in reserve at Fort Knox. Other countries, noticing this growing imbalance, began to call America's bluff. They demanded gold in exchange for their dollars. By 1971, the United States was facing a full-blown crisis, a potential run on its gold reserves. President Richard Nixon was forced to make a decision that would fundamentally reshape the global financial system. In a televised address, he announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars into gold at a fixed value. With that single act, the gold standard was effectively dead. The link between money and a physical commodity was severed. From that moment forward, the world's money became pure fiat currency. The term comes from Latin, meaning, "let it be so." Money now had value simply because governments declared it so. It was backed by nothing more than trust in the stability and authority of the issuing state. This untethering of money from the physical world was the financial equivalent of a big bang. It granted governments and central banks a power that had never truly existed before, the ability to create money, and by extension credit, with no practical upper limit. And so, beginning in the 1980s, the great global debt supercycle began. Governments realized that borrowing was no longer reserved for wars or emergencies. It could be used as a primary tool to stimulate growth, to soften economic downturns, and to fulfill political promises without immediately raising taxes. And so they borrowed. They borrowed to build airports and universities. They borrowed to rescue failing banks. They borrowed to send direct payments to citizens during a global pandemic. In just a few decades, debt evolved from a flaw in the system to its central operating feature. The result is the vast mountain of promises we live under today, a global debt load approaching $346 trillion by the end of 2025. To give that number some physical meaning, imagine stacking $100 bills. A stack of $1 million would rise only to about waist height. A stack of $1 billion would tower higher than the tallest skyscraper. A stack representing the United States national debt, more than $38 trillion, would stretch tens of thousands of miles into space. But a stack representing the entire world's debt, roughly $346 trillion, would extend well beyond 190,000 miles. It would reach most of the distance to the moon. That is the true scale of the system we have constructed. So if every nation is a debtor, who holds all these promises? If everyone owes, who is the one that is owed? We often imagine some shadowy global elite, a small group of unimaginably wealthy individuals pulling the strings from behind the scenes. But the reality is both more ordinary and far more unsettling. The global debt system is not a straight line from a lender to a borrower. It is a closed loop, a vast circulatory system that moves capital continuously around the planet. Let's look again at the United States, the world's largest debtor. Who could possibly possess the resources to lend it more than $38 trillion? The surprising answer is that the largest single holder of United States debt is the American public itself, acting through its institutions. More than 2/3 of the national debt is owed to domestic entities. In essence, America's biggest creditor is America's future. This is how the loop functions. We know governments borrow by selling bonds, certificates of debt that pay interest over a fixed term. And who buys these bonds? Very likely, you do, indirectly. When you contribute to a pension plan or pay premiums to an insurance company, that money does not sit idle in a vault. These institutions have a fiduciary obligation to make those funds grow safely so they can meet future commitments, to pay retirement income, or to cover claims decades from now. To do that, they need investments that are both secure and predictable, and there is no asset on earth considered safer or more predictable than a bond issued by the United States government. So they take the trillions of dollars in collective savings under their management and invest heavily in U.S. Treasury bonds. By 2025, American insurance companies and pension funds together hold well over $7 trillion of their own government's debt. Bonds are the bedrock of the modern financial portfolio for a reason. Unlike stocks, their value does not swing wildly with market sentiment. The interest rate, or yield, is fixed at the moment of purchase and guaranteed for the life of the bond. For an institution managing a retirement horizon that stretches decades into the future, that certainty is invaluable. The central bank, the Federal Reserve, can raise or lower interest rates on newly issued bonds to cool the economy or stimulate it. In the early 1980s, as the United States fought runaway inflation, bond yields climbed above 14%. During the economic turmoil of 2020, they were pushed close to zero to encourage borrowing and spending. But for the bondholder, the rate is locked in. A 30-year bond purchased at roughly 4% will pay that same rate every year until maturity, regardless of what the economy does in the meantime. This combination of near absolute safety and predictable return is what makes government debt the foundational asset of the global financial system. And it is not only pension funds. Any large pool of capital seeking stability gravitates toward government bonds. Commercial banks, which are required to hold a portion of their assets in ultra-safe instruments, are major buyers. So are university endowments, large corporations holding excess cash, and mutual funds designed for conservative investors. This dynamic creates an intricate, largely invisible loop in which a nation's savings are channeled to fund the nation's spending. When you hear that the United States government is borrowing from itself, this is what it means in practice. Capital flows from parts of the economy where it is being saved into the part where it is being spent. And when the government pays interest on that debt, where does the money go? It flows straight back to the pension funds, banks, and insurance companies that hold the bonds. Those institutions now have more cash, which they then use to buy more bonds. The cycle reinforces itself. The same circular logic extends across the entire global system. Roughly 1/3 of United States government debt is held by foreign entities. Why would the Central Bank of Japan or a sovereign wealth fund in Norway want to buy American IOUs? For the same reason domestic institutions do. United States Treasury bonds are still viewed as the safest place on earth to store vast reserves of capital. This creates an international loop. China sells goods to the United States and accumulates dollars. Those dollars are then used to purchase U.S. bonds, effectively lending the money back to its largest customer. The United States pays interest on those bonds, sending dollars back to China, and the cycle continues. And this pattern is not unique to America. Every developed economy sits at the center of its own vortex. The savings of German households held in German banks become loans to the French government. The foreign reserves held by Brazil's central bank are used to purchase Japanese bonds. Capital circulates globally, endlessly, reinforcing the same structure everywhere. The world's more than $340 trillion of debt is not a sign that the system is broken. It is the system functioning exactly as it was designed to function. It is a dynamic, pulsating network of interlocking loops. Capital flows continuously from savers to borrowers and back again, and interest payments are the current that keeps everything in motion. The vast majority of this money never leaves the financial system at all. It simply changes form, changes hands, and keeps circulating endlessly. So if governments never truly intend to pay down the principal on this debt, how can such a system possibly be sustainable? The simple and deeply unsettling answer is that they do not need to. As old debt comes due, it is paid off with newly issued debt. This process is known as rolling over the debt. On a personal level, this would be considered catastrophic financial mismanagement. But at the level of a nation-state, it has become the fundamental operating principle of modern economics. Why would the world deliberately construct a system that appears so precarious? Because we have engineered our economies to be completely dependent on this cycle for both survival and growth. The uncomfortable truth is that, in the world we have built, new debt functions as the primary engine of economic activity. When a government borrows $1 billion and spends it on a high-speed rail project, that money does not vanish. It is paid to engineers, construction workers, and suppliers of materials. Those workers then use their wages to buy groceries, pay rent or mortgages, and spend money at local businesses. The businesses pay their employees and suppliers. The effect ripples outward. It creates a positive feedback loop that stimulates the entire economy and, at least in theory, increases overall prosperity. In the United States, more than 1/4 of all federal spending is financed not through taxes, but through new borrowing. That means roughly 1 out of every $4 the government spends, on everything from military salaries to medical research, is created through debt. In Japan, the figure is even higher, approaching 1 out of every 3 yen. If these governments were to suddenly stop borrowing and attempt to balance their budgets overnight, the result would be immediate and severe. They would be forced to implement spending cuts so deep that they would trigger a sharp economic contraction. The positive feedback loop would be thrown violently into reverse. Businesses would lose contracts, Unemployment would surge, the economy would shrink, leaving nearly everyone worse off. For a stark example of what this looks like in reality, consider the European debt crisis of 2012. Global investors lost confidence in the ability of countries such as Greece and Spain to repay their debts. They stopped buying those countries' bonds, cutting them off from the ability to borrow. Deprived of this financial lifeblood, governments were forced into harsh austerity measures. Public services were slashed, pensions were reduced, millions of jobs disappeared. The Greek economy contracted by more than 25%, a collapse deeper than the one the United States experienced during the Great Depression. Politicians and central bankers understand this reality instinctively. No one wins elections by promising to intentionally shrink the economy. Voters demand growth, and in the system we now inhabit, growth requires spending, and spending requires borrowing. Debt, whether acknowledged openly or not, has become both a political and an economic necessity. It is not only about stimulating growth. Very often, it is about pure survival. When a black swan event like the 2020 pandemic strikes, the private economy effectively shuts down. People stay home. Businesses close. The normal flow of money grinds to a halt. In that moment, the only entity with the power to prevent a total collapse is the government. It must step in and become the spender of last resort. But during a crisis, tax revenues also collapse. So the government is left with only one viable option: to borrow on a scale that would be unthinkable under normal circumstances. In that single year alone, global government debt increased by more than $15 trillion. It was not a political choice. It was the only alternative to a worldwide economic depression. And here lies the core of the paradox. When you borrow, you make a promise to repay. But if a government is already spending nearly every tax dollar it collects, where does the money come from to repay the trillions in old debt that are constantly coming due? The answer is simple. It comes from borrowing again in the present to pay for the promises made in the past. The debt is never truly extinguished. It is perpetually rolled forward into the future. For a stable, wealthy country such as the United States or Germany, this perpetual motion machine can operate smoothly for a very long time. Their government bonds remain in high demand, allowing them to consistently find new lenders willing to roll over their debt at relatively low interest rates. For many developing nations, however, the same cycle becomes a deadly trap. Investors perceive these countries as riskier, and so they demand higher interest rates. Each rollover becomes more expensive than the last. Before long, countries such as Pakistan or Ghana find themselves caught in a vicious spiral. They are forced to take on new, increasingly expensive loans simply to make the interest payments on older ones. The debt begins to compound. It feeds on itself until it consumes the broader economy. So when people ask why we cannot simply stop this madness and live within our means, the honest answer is that we are too far in to turn back. The very debt that hangs over us like a gathering storm cloud is also the pillar holding up the entire roof of the modern world. And that reality forces us to confront an even more unsettling question. Can a system that requires infinite growth on a finite planet truly continue forever? Because hidden just beneath the surface of this smoothly operating machine are systemic risks that continue to grow larger with each passing year. As a government's total debt accumulates, the annual interest payments on that debt begin to consume a larger and larger share of its budget. In the United States, net interest payments on the national debt are projected to exceed $1 trillion per year, a figure larger than the entire annual defense budget. That is $1 trillion that cannot be spent on education, healthcare, infrastructure, or scientific research. It is simply the cost of servicing promises made in the past. This arrangement remains manageable as long as interest rates stay relatively low and the economy continues to grow. But the system is inherently fragile. If global investors begin to doubt a country's long-term stability or its political willingness to repay, they will demand higher interest rates to compensate for the perceived risk. A government caught in this position faces a dangerous temptation. It can instruct its central bank to create new money to purchase government bonds. This practice is often referred to as monetizing the debt, At first glance, it appears to be a painless solution, but it carries a severe and often delayed cost. When new money floods the economy while the supply of goods and services remains unchanged, the value of the currency inevitably erodes. This is the mechanism behind inflation. Prices rise, savings lose purchasing power, and trust in the currency itself begins to weaken. In extreme cases, this dynamic can spiral into hyperinflation. In Argentina, a country that has defaulted on its sovereign debt 9 times, the government's long-term reliance on money creation to cover fiscal deficits has produced periods in which prices doubled every few months, erasing the life savings of entire generations almost overnight. While a major economy like the United States is unlikely to experience such an extreme outcome, even prolonged moderate inflation functions as a hidden tax. It steadily erodes purchasing power, quietly transferring wealth away from savers and toward debtors and governments. The risks are even more severe for developing countries that are often forced to borrow in a foreign currency, most commonly United States dollars. This introduces an additional layer of vulnerability. If a country's local currency weakens against the dollar, the real cost of repaying dollar-denominated debt explodes. What follows can be a classic doom loop. As the debt burden rises, investors grow nervous and sell the local currency. The currency falls further. The debt becomes even more expensive to service. Eventually, lenders lose confidence altogether. The country can no longer find anyone willing to lend at any price. The rollover machine grinds to a halt. With payments coming due and no new money available to meet them, the country runs out of options. It defaults. A sovereign default is a formal admission that the promises can no longer be honored. It is a catastrophic event. Trust evaporates. The government is shut out of international credit markets. The domestic banking system often collapses, and the broader economy is plunged into a deep and painful crisis. This brings us back to the central, inescapable dilemma. Our global civilization has built an economic engine that has delivered unprecedented prosperity. It has financed technological breakthroughs. It has lifted billions of people out of poverty. But that same engine requires a constant and ever-increasing supply of debt to keep running. To abandon the cycle now would be to knowingly trigger a global depression that would dwarf the collapse of the 1930s. To continue along the same path is to wager that we can manage growing fragility and ever-present systemic risk indefinitely. We are all passengers in a vehicle that is accelerating. No one is entirely certain of the road ahead. And there are no brakes. The true problem is not the existence of hundreds of trillions of dollars in global debt. It is the fact that the system now requires that number to keep rising, from 340 trillion to 350 and beyond. The question is no longer who owns our promises. It is whether a system built on infinite promises can survive in a finite world